Lord Aldrich Vane. No, that name was taken. Lord Emmerich Duskmore watched from the doorway of the Hatherswick Employment Registry as the woman at the clerk's counter pressed both palms flat against the wooden ledge and said, with a steadiness that struck him as almost theatrical in its control, that she would take the position as bookkeeper at whatever wage they were offering, and that she would begin that same afternoon. She was, he noted, wearing gloves with a mended seam at the left thumb, and the hem of her coat had been turned twice. A skilled repair, nearly invisible, but not quite. She had known better clothes once. That much was certain. His name was Lord Emmerich Duncastle, and he had not intended to visit the employment registry at all. He had come to this particular street in Bath because the solicitor whose offices occupied the floor above had sent him a letter regarding a property dispute that had dragged through the courts for 11 months. He had paused in the doorway, only because the woman's voice carried a quality he had not encountered in some time. Not loudness, not distress, but a kind of compressed certainty. The way a river sounds when it has been forced through a narrow channel and has decided without drama to simply push through. The clerk was saying something about references. The woman, she had given her name as Rowena Ashby, opened a leather satchel and produced a folded document with the practiced efficiency of someone who had anticipated the objection. She did not offer it apologetically. She placed it on the counter and waited. Emmerich, who had spent 3 centuries observing the way human beings navigated humiliation, recognized immediately that this woman had been humiliated before and had decided, at some point, that she was finished being apologetic about it. He should have gone upstairs to the solicitor. Instead, he remained in the doorway for a moment longer than was proper, and then he went upstairs. Rowena Ashby had been bookkeeper, companion, and general account keeper for the Ashby family's dye works in Bristol until 18 months ago, when the family's dye works had ceased to be the Ashby family's dye works at all. Her father, a man of genuine intelligence and spectacular poor judgment in partners, had trusted his business to a man named Gideon Ferris, and Gideon Ferris had, over the course of 4 years, systematically redirected the company's revenues into his own accounts, while constructing a paper trail that suggested the Ashby family patriarch had been the architect of the fraud. By the time the truth had been established in court, and it had been established eventually at considerable cost, the company was gone. The house in Clifton had been sold to satisfy creditors, and her father's reputation had been restored only in the technical sense that a document existed somewhere saying he had not, in fact, stolen from his own workers. The workers had not been paid. That was the part that had cost Rowena the most. She had given her testimony in court. She had organized the ledgers that proved the redirection. She had spent 14 months doing this while living in 2 rented rooms in a street that smelled of tallow and river damp, working as a copyist for a solicitor's firm by day and spending her evenings reconstructing, from memory and from the fragments she had retained, the financial history of a company that no longer existed. She had done all of this quietly, without assistance, and without telling anyone, including the family friends who had offered sympathy and loans, exactly what it had cost her. Her father knew. He had wept, once, in a way that had embarrassed them both, and she had made tea, and they had not spoken of it again. The position at Hatherswick's registry had connected her to a small firm of wool merchants in Bath who needed someone to manage their accounts. It was not elegant work. She did not require it to be elegant. She required it to pay for the rooms she had taken in a house on Milsom Street, which were clean and quiet, and had a window that faced east, which meant she had light in the mornings for reading. She read mathematics texts the way other women read novels, with absorption and a faint sense of guilt, as though the pleasure ought to be more difficult to justify. She had been in Bath for 3 weeks when she encountered Lord Emmerich Duncastle for the second time. The first time she had not known who he was. She had simply noticed, in the way she noticed most things, that the man in the doorway of the registry had been watching her with an attention that was neither predatory nor pitying, which made it unusual. Most people who watched a woman in mended gloves negotiating for employment were doing one or the other. He had been doing something else. Something that felt, at the remove of 3 weeks, more like recognition, though she was certain they had never met. The second encounter occurred at a concert at the Assembly Rooms, which she attended not because she moved in the social circles that frequented the Assembly Rooms, but because the wool merchant's firm had a standing subscription, and the senior partner, a kind-faced man named Mr. Aldous Breck, had pressed a ticket into her hand on Friday afternoon with the instruction that she was working too hard and ought to hear some Schubert. She had accepted the ticket because refusing small kindnesses was a habit she was trying to dismantle, one careful refusal at a time. She was sitting in the third row from the back, which suited her, when Lord Duncastle sat down in the seat beside her. Not the seat adjacent, there was an empty seat between them, but close enough that she was aware of him the way one is aware of a window left open, a change in the quality of the air, a sense of something beyond the ordinary boundary of a room. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at the orchestra assembling on the stage, and she looked at him, because she was constitutionally incapable of sitting next to an interesting question without examining it. He was tall in the way that made sitting beside him feel like sitting beside something architectural. His face was pale in a way that the candlelight did not entirely explain, and his coat was of a quality that suggested money old enough to have forgotten it was money. He held his program with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting, not impatience suppressed, but genuine ease with duration. "You were at the registry," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out the way observations came out when she forgot to manage them. He turned to look at her then. His eyes were a dark amber, the color of old cognac, and they held a quality she could not immediately name. Not surprise, more like the expression of someone who has heard a familiar piece of music played in an unexpected key. "I was," he said. "You were watching me." "I was." He did not apologize for it. "You were interesting to watch." She considered this. The orchestra began to tune, filling the space with that pleasant productive discord of preparation. "Most people find a woman arguing for employment rather depressing," she said. "Most people," he said, "are not paying sufficient attention." She did not know what to do with that. She looked back at the stage. After a moment, he said, "I am Emmerich Duncastle. I have a house on the Royal Crescent, and a property dispute that has occupied my solicitor for nearly a year. Rowena Ashby," she said, "I have a position at Breck & Sons and a window that faces east." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a good window to have." The music began, and they did not speak again for the duration of the first movement. But she was aware, throughout, of the slight warmth that came from his direction. Not body heat, exactly, but something else. Something she filed away under the heading of things to examine later, when she was alone with her mathematics texts, and her east-facing window, and the quiet that had become, in the past 18 months, the most reliable thing in her life. After the concert, he offered to walk her to her street. She accepted, because it was practical and because the night was clear, and because she wanted to know more about the man who had looked at her with recognition in a doorway. They walked along the parades in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and he asked her nothing about her coat or her gloves or her reduced circumstances, which she noted. Most people who suspected a fall from position felt compelled to either avoid the subject with aggressive cheerfulness or probe it with delicate inquisition. He did neither. He asked her instead about the concert. She told him she thought the cellist was technically accomplished but emotionally provisional, that he played as though he were not entirely certain the music deserved the feeling he was being asked to give it. Emmerich stopped walking for a moment and looked at her. "That is exactly right," he said. "You play?" she asked. "I played, some centuries ago." He said it lightly, as though it were a figure of speech. She filed it away. They reached her street. He said good evening with a formality that was not coldness, but rather the courtesy of someone who understood that she had given him something by accepting the walk, and did not wish to diminish it by overreaching. She went inside and stood in her 2 rooms, and noticed that the quality of the silence had changed, the way a room changes after a piece of music ends, not empty, but resonant. He called on her at Breck and Sons the following Thursday, which was not a social call, and both of them knew it. He had, he said, a set of accounts belonging to a charitable trust he administered that had become disordered due to a change in trustees, and Mr. Breck had recommended her as someone with a particular facility for disordered accounts. Mr. Breck, she noted, looked pleased with himself in a way that suggested he had not been entirely passive in this arrangement. She did not mention this. She agreed to look at the accounts. The accounts were, in fact, disordered. They were also interesting. The Trust, the Duncastle Benevolent Foundation, established, according to its charter, in 1743, which she noted with private arithmetic, administered funds for the education of working-class boys in 4 counties. The records showed a pattern of meticulous care interrupted, at irregular intervals, by gaps of 3 to 4 years, during which the entries were made in a different hand, the expenditures continued without interruption, and then resumed in the original hand as though the gap had not occurred. She counted 4 such gaps in the records she was given, spanning 80 years. She mentioned none of this to Emmerich when he returned the following week to review her preliminary findings. She told him the accounts needed reorganization by category rather than by date, that 2 of the current trustees appeared to be duplicating payments without awareness of the duplication, and that the fund was, overall, in better health than the disorder suggested. He listened with the focused attention of someone who genuinely cared about the answer. "You have done this sort of work before," he said. "I organized the accounts of my family's company for 12 years, she said. And then I spent 14 months organizing the evidence that proved those accounts had been tampered with." He was quiet. Then, "The Ashby Dye Works case." She looked at him. "You know of it?" "I read the Bath papers," he said, "and the Bristol papers. The verdict was reported. The reporting was insufficient." He said the word carefully, as though choosing it from a larger collection of words he had decided not to use. "Insufficient," she agreed, "is accurate." "The man responsible," he said, "Ferris, is living in Edinburgh," she said, "with his wife and his undisturbed fortune, because the court established my father's innocence, but lacked sufficient evidence to establish Ferris's guilt. The distinction mattered to the law. It did not restore my father's workers their wages." She said this without heat, which was the result of practice. She had learned that heat made people uncomfortable and discomfort made people useless. She needed people to be useful. She had paid the workers herself, not all of them, and not fully, but as much as she could from the sale of her own jewelry and the 18 months of copyist work. She had told no one this. It was not something she intended to tell anyone. Emmerich looked at her for a long moment. His amber eyes had gone very still, the way water goes still before something moves beneath it. "You are angry," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have found anger more useful than grief. And the anger is not only about the workers." She paused. "No," she said. "It is also about the fact that I knew, for 2 years before the collapse, that something was wrong. I said so. I was told I did not understand the complexities of business partnership." She picked up her pen. "I understood them perfectly." He said nothing, but she had the sense, again, of recognition, of being seen in the specific rather than the general, which was rarer than it ought to have been. Over the following 3 weeks, he came to the offices twice more, and she came to the Royal Crescent once to examine the original trust documents. The house was extraordinary, not in the way of houses that have been decorated to impress, but in the way of houses that have accumulated meaning over a long time, where every object has a history that is not performed but simply present. She noticed a painting above the library fireplace that depicted a man who looked remarkably like Emmerich in the dress of the previous century. She noticed that the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Plum, spoke to him with the ease of someone who had known him for decades, though Mrs. Plum was not young. She noticed that there were no mirrors in the rooms he used most frequently. She noticed 3 rooms with the curtains drawn against the afternoon light. And she noticed that when she had arrived at 2 in the afternoon, he had met her in the hall with a slight stiffness about his movements, as though the light coming through the open door had cost him something. By 4 o'clock, when the light had softened, he had been himself again, fluid, present, entirely at ease. She was not a woman who reached conclusions quickly, but she was a woman who reached them correctly. The 4th week, she did not wait for him to come to her. She went to the Royal Crescent at 7 in the evening, when the sky was the color of a bruised plum, and the gas lights were just being lit along the crescent's great curve. Mrs. Plum admitted her without surprise, which itself was information. She was shown to the library, where Emmerich was reading by the fire, and he rose when she entered with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been trained in an era when courtesy was not optional. "Miss Ashby," he said. "I have a question," she said, "and I would prefer a direct answer to a comfortable one." He gestured toward the chair across from his. She sat. He sat. The fire moved between them, and the room smelled of old paper and beeswax, and something else, something cool and faintly mineral, like the air at the entrance to a cave. "The painting above the fireplace," she said, "was made in 1761, according to the date in the lower corner. The subject is you." He did not deny it. "The trust was established in 1743. The earliest records are in your handwriting. The handwriting is identical to the records from last year." She paused. "The gaps in the records occur every 20 years or so. I believe those are the periods during which you were obliged to be absent from Bath, to prevent exactly this kind of observation." He was very still. "I am not frightened," she said, because she thought it was important to establish that immediately. "I am asking because I prefer to know the truth of a situation I am involved in. I have had enough of operating on incomplete information." Emmerich set down his book with the careful deliberateness of someone buying himself a moment. Then he said, "How long have you known?" "Suspected," she said. 3 weeks. Known with reasonable certainty since this afternoon, when I found the baptismal record in the trust documents that lists you as a trustee in 1743 and gives your age as 32. He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that contained a history of occasions when full smiling had seemed too much to ask of the moment. "You found the baptismal record." "I am a bookkeeper," she said. "I find everything." He told her then, in the measured, unsentimental manner of someone who had rehearsed the conversation many times in theory and never expected to have it in practice. He had been born in 1711. The nature of his condition, he used the word condition rather than curse, which she thought was telling, had come upon him in 1742, the result of a choice he had made and would not unmake, though the circumstances of that choice he did not elaborate on that evening. He did not require the things that Gothic novels suggested he required. He required discretion, occasional distance from prolonged daylight, and the kind of solitude that allowed him to exist in a world that moved faster than he did without losing himself entirely in the contrast. "And you established the trust," she said. "The year after." "I had a great deal of time," he said, "and a great deal of money, and a great deal of guilt about both." She looked at him steadily. "That is an honest answer. You asked for one." She sat with this for a moment, in the way she sat with complex ledgers, not rushing to a conclusion but letting the shape of the thing become clear. Then she said, "I have one more question." "Yes." "Gideon Ferris," she said. "Did you do something?" The quality of his stillness changed. It became the stillness of a man who has been caught in an act of consideration he had not intended to be visible. "What makes you ask?" he said. "Because 3 days ago," she said, "I received a letter from my father's former solicitor in Bristol. It contained a note informing him that an anonymous review of the Ferris case had been submitted to the Edinburgh courts, a review that included documentation my father's legal team had never possessed. Documentation that establishes, apparently quite conclusively, Ferris's guilt." She paused. "The documentation was organized in a manner that was familiar to me. The categories, the sequencing. It was organized the way I would have organized it, if I had had access to the original Ferris accounts, which I did not. Emmerich said nothing. But you did, she said. You have access to things that ordinary people do not. You have been alive for a very long time and you have connections that span decades. You went into those accounts and you built the case that I could not build, and you submitted it without telling me. Yes, he said. She stood up. The radiator ticked and hissed between them. She walked to the window, the curtained window, the one that faced the crescent. And she stood with her back to him for a moment, and the quality of her silence was not grief and not gratitude. It was something with edges. You had no right, she said. He did not answer immediately. That was my case, she said. Those were my father's accounts. That was my work, 14 months of it, in 2 rooms that smelled of tallow, and I was not able to complete it because I did not have what I needed. And instead of asking me, instead of telling me that you had access to what I needed, you went around me. You built it without me. You submitted it without asking whether that was what I wanted. The workers, he said quietly. They had not been paid. She turned around. I know they had not been paid. I paid them, what I could, with what I had, because it was my responsibility, and I took it. Her voice was steady, and it was not gentle. You do not get to decide that my choices were insufficient and correct them without my knowledge. I am not a problem you have identified and solved. I am a person. He stood. He did not move toward her. He stood the way someone stands when they understand that moving toward is exactly the wrong thing, and they are doing the difficult work of staying still. You are right, he said. I know I am right. I did not ask, he said, because I did not think you would accept help, and I wanted the outcome. I wanted Ferris to face consequences. I wanted your father's name to be more than technically cleared. He paused. I wanted it for you, and I went about it in a way that removed you from it entirely. That was wrong. She looked at him. The fire had settled into a steadier burn, and in its light his face had the particular quality of old portraits, not flat, but layered, as though the current expression sat on top of many previous ones. How did you access the Ferris accounts? She said. A business associate in Edinburgh, he said. A man who owed me a consideration of long standing. I asked him to obtain the relevant documents through channels that are not strictly conventional. Not strictly conventional, she repeated, meaning illegal. Meaning the kind of thing that becomes legal once the documents are in the hands of a court, and the court finds them useful. She pressed her lips together. This was, she recognized, exactly the kind of reasoning that she ought to object to on principle, and found in practice extremely difficult to argue with when the result was Gideon Ferris facing a court in Edinburgh. There is a problem, she said, beyond the question of my agency, which we are not finished discussing. Tell me. Ferris will know someone went into his accounts. He will know it was not legal. He has a solicitor. A very good solicitor, a man named Chetwood, who has been protecting him for years. Chetwood will argue that the documentation was obtained improperly and move to have it excluded. And if Chetwood discovers the connection to you, she stopped. He will use it. He will make the case that you have a personal interest, that the submission was malicious rather than evidentiary, and the Edinburgh court will throw it out. Emmerich was quiet. Did you think of that? She said. I thought of it, he said. I believed the quality of the evidence would outweigh the question of its origin. You were wrong, she said. Legal proceedings do not work that way. I know. I have spent 14 months in them. She sat back down, not in capitulation, in decision. We need to fix this. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not admiration exactly. It was closer to the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been offered, not relief from it, but company in carrying it. What do you propose? He said. The documentation you obtained, she said. Is there a legitimate version of it? Records that could be obtained through proper channels? Court filings, company registrations, public accounts? Some of it, he said. Not all. Then we use what can be obtained legitimately and build from that. The illegitimate documentation shows us where to look. We use it as a map, not as evidence. She paused. I know how Ferris structured his redirections. I know what the legitimate records would look like if someone knew exactly where to find them. I can write the request. I know the legal language. I learned it over 14 months of very expensive education. And Chetwood? He said. Chetwood is protecting a man he believes has successfully escaped consequences, she said. If he discovers that the original submission contained improperly obtained documents, he will move immediately to have the case dismissed. We need to get the legitimate submission filed before he makes that move. We need to be faster than him. Emmerich looked at her. How much time do we have? The Edinburgh court received the original submission last week, she said. Chetwood's office is in Edinburgh. He will have heard about it within 2 days. He will have reviewed it within a week. We have perhaps 10 days before he files his objection. Then we begin tonight, Emmerich said. Yes, she said. We do. They worked through the night and the following 2 nights, in the library of the Royal Crescent, with the curtains drawn against the light, and the fire kept high, and Mrs. Plum bringing tea at intervals, with the equanimity of someone who had seen stranger things in this house and kept her own counsel about all of them. Rowena wrote the requests and the legal framing. Emmerich provided the connections. The Edinburgh associate who knew which public records had been filed and when. The contact at Company's House in London who could confirm the incorporation details. The Bath solicitor who agreed, on the strength of Emmerich's long patronage, to attach his name to the submission and file it through proper channels. On the second night, at approximately 2 in the morning, when the fire had burned low and she had been writing for 6 hours without pause, Emmerich set a cup of tea beside her hand and said, You should rest. I should finish this paragraph, she said. You have been writing without stopping since 8 o'clock. I am aware of what time it is. She finished the paragraph. Then she set down her pen and picked up the tea and looked at him across the scattered papers. Why did you do it? She said. Not the method. I understand the method. Why did you do it at all? You had no obligation to my family. He was quiet for a moment. The fire had gone to embers and the room was lit mostly by the lamp on the desk, which made everything look close and amber and provisional. When I saw you in the registry, he said, pressing your palms flat on the counter and asking for what you needed with that particular steadiness, I recognized something. The posture of someone who has been carrying a weight that was not theirs to carry, and has decided to carry it anyway, because the alternative is that it falls on someone else. He paused. I have been carrying things that were not mine to carry for a very long time. I recognize it. And I saw that you were doing it alone, and He stopped. You wanted to help, she said. I wanted to help, he said, in the way that people help when they have not learned yet to ask permission first. She looked at her tea. It is a difficult thing to learn, she said. Asking permission, it implies that the other person might say no. And if you had said no, he said. I might have, she said, or I might not. You will never know, because you did not ask. She looked up. But I am not saying this to punish you. I am saying it because if we are going to continue to know each other, I need you to understand that I am not someone to be managed. I have had enough of being managed by people who thought they knew better. Ferris, he said, Ferris, and others before him. People who saw a woman with a facility for numbers and concluded that the facility was charming, but the judgment was not to be trusted. She set down the tea. My judgment is very good. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You have been alone for a very long time. It was not a question. He answered it anyway. Yes. Is that by choice? By necessity, he said. Or what I told myself was necessity. It is difficult, after a certain point, to distinguish between the two. She picked up her pen again. Then perhaps, she said, returning to the document, you should practice asking. On the 9th day, The legitimate submission was filed through the Bath solicitor's office. On the 11th day, Chetwood filed his objection to the original submission. The Edinburgh court, reviewing both filings, determined that the original submission contained material of uncertain provenance and set it aside, but that the subsequent legitimate submission contained sufficient grounds to proceed. Ferris was summoned to appear. The case was reopened. Rowena received this news in the form of a letter from the Bath solicitor, delivered to Breck and Sons on a Thursday morning when the light was very clear, and the wool samples on Mr. Breck's desk smelled of lanolin and distant hills. She read the letter twice. Then she went to the window and looked at the street below, the ordinary street, the carts and the pedestrians, and the woman selling flowers from a basket, and she felt something shift inside her that had been braced for a very long time. Not relief exactly, something more structural than relief. Like a wall that has been holding back pressure finally being given permission to become a window. She went to the Royal Crescent that evening. Emmerich was in the garden, or what had been a garden, and was now more accurately a very large private space behind the house, with old stone paths and something that might once have been a parterre, and was now gloriously overgrown in the manner of things that have been left alone long enough to become interesting. She found him there in the early evening light, which had gone gold and horizontal, and she noticed that he stood in the shadow of the garden wall with a slight deliberateness that was not quite casualness. "Ferris is to appear," she said. "I know," he said. "My solicitor wrote." "The workers will have a claim now," she said. "There will be a recovery of assets. It will not be everything, but it will be something real." "Yes," he said. She stood in the garden among the overgrown things, and the evening smelled of old stone and late roses and the cool mineral quality that she had come to associate with his particular presence. She said, "I am not going to thank you." He looked at her. "I did not expect you to, but I am—" She paused, searching for the precise word in the way she searched for the precise figure in a column of accounts. "I am glad," she said, "that you were in that doorway, even if your methods were high-handed and your assumption that I would not accept help was insulting." "Both of those things are true," he said. "And I am glad," she said, "that you told me the truth when I asked. About what you are. About what you did." "I am not certain I had a choice," he said. "You had already found the baptismal record." "You could have lied," she said. "People have lied to me before about smaller things." He was quiet. A late bird called from somewhere beyond the garden wall, and the sound of the street was very distant, and the light had gone from gold to something softer. "I did not want to lie to you," he said. "I find that I am very tired of things I have done out of habit rather than choice." She walked toward him, into the shadow of the wall where he stood, and she looked up at him with the direct attention she gave to things she found genuinely worth examining. He was very still, in the way he was always still, not frozen, but economical, as though he had learned over a very long time to make each movement mean something. "I have a proposal," she said. "A practical one." "Tell me." "The trust accounts need ongoing management," she said. "Not just reorganization, proper, consistent, quarterly management. The current structure is inadequate. I could manage them, not as a charitable act, but as a professional engagement, at a proper rate." He looked at her for a moment. "That is a practical proposal." "I am a practical person." "And the less practical element?" he said, because he was, she had discovered, very good at reading the shape of what she was not saying. She looked at him steadily. "I have been alone," she said, "for 18 months. Not unhappily. I have my mathematics and my east window and my work. But I have been alone in the specific way of someone who has decided that connection requires a kind of trust she is not certain she can afford." She paused. "You are a person, and I am using that word deliberately, who understands what it is to carry things alone, who has done it for a very long time, who made a mistake with me that was made from wanting rather than from malice, and who did not argue when I called it a mistake." She paused again. I find that I would like to know you better, if that is something you would like. He did not answer immediately. The garden held the silence the way old gardens hold silence, not emptily, but with a kind of accumulated patience. I have not allowed myself to want that, he said, for a very long time. The particular mathematics of my situation make it complicated. I am good at complicated mathematics, she said. Something moved across his face then. Not the controlled, almost smile she had seen before, but something more unguarded. Something that had been waiting behind the courtesy and the stillness for longer than she could calculate. I know, he said. They stood in the garden as the evening completed itself around them, the last light going from the sky in layers. And she thought of the assembly rooms, and the concert, and the cellist who had played as though he was not certain the music deserved the feeling. And she thought that she understood, now, what it was to be uncertain whether the feeling was warranted, whether it was safe to give it, whether the giving would cost more than she had. She thought of 14 months in 2 rooms that smelled of tallow, and of the weight she